So we talked about buttons yesterday. Today we want to talk a bit more about some of the other widgets that are available primarily for user input, right? So there's a lot of ways to get input from the user. The only two that we've used so far have been buttons and text fields, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about text fields today. We'll talk a little bit more as well about some of the other input controls that are available. Also want to go over briefly how does focus work in Android, because that concept still carries over from desktop web. There's still an idea of focus where one control always has the focus, but how that works in Android is maybe a little bit different. We also want to talk about text, numbers, text fields. There's some additional pieces that we want to talk about there, and then going over some of the different controls that we have to provide alternate choices. So that will be there. Okay, so kind of an overview. A few different controls that we'll talk about today. So first of all, for freeform text or numbers, anything that the user uses the keyboard for, that's where the EditText comes in. Okay, and that keyboard can actually change quite a bit, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so the keyboard actually, there's a lot of ways to change or tweak what kind of mode or keyboard that you see. Next option we have in there is checkboxes, radio buttons, and spinners, which we all use if we have, hey, here's a predefined list of things that the user can pick from. Just pick one of those things, right? So EditText gives them a lot broader range of things that they can select, right? They can type in any text, they can type in any number, but if we have a much more finer grained set of things that they can choose, that's where those come in. We'll also talk about the switch and the toggle switch controls, which basically do the same thing. They just look different visually. So that's anytime you want to turn a setting on or off is generally where those are used. And then finally, in there we've also got the seek bar. The seek bar we won't talk about today. It's pretty self-explanatory when you get there. You basically slide it left and right, and that picks a value usually from 0 to 100. But we won't spend too much time on it because honestly they don't come up very often. A lot of the problems that we do don't necessarily use seek bars. So kind of looking at what those controls look like. What do they look like graphically? So we have, first of all, the edit text, which we see, which conventionally is, hey, there's an underline there for text to indicate that there's text entry. There's also, you can see there's some grayed out text, right? So we call that the hint. Usually we want to provide hints on our text fields wherever possible, kind of in addition to maybe the label that goes with it. And that's actually, those hints are a little bit more important on mobile, simply because of the amount of screen space that we have available. Does that make sense? So we kind of want to use that hint because we don't have screen space, because that screen space is kind of free screen space. You've got the slider, or the seek bar down here. That slide left and right. We've got checkboxes as we're used to. We've got radio buttons, which are circles. What's the difference between a radio button and a checkbox, just from memory? Yeah. So you can check more than one option with the checkbox. You can only pick one option with the radio button. Okay. So then we also have, here's a switch. Toggle button is kind of a similar functionality but looks different. And then we have what we call here a spinner. Okay. Now a spinner is traditionally what we would call, in the desktop world, we would call it a drop-down list. The reason it's called a spinner is because it does have different behavior on a mobile device. Okay. Now a spinner is one of those kind of interesting controls that behaves differently on a phone than it does on a tablet. So a lot of times if you have a spinner on a phone, it'll actually, when you open up the options, it will not be a drop down, but it'll usually open up as a dialog window. So it'll actually show up as a dialog window on mobile phones versus just showing up as a drop down on tablets. So that's one of those things you have to kind of be aware of. And when you're using a spinner, you'll definitely want to test it both on phones and on tablets to make sure that the behavior in both cases kind of works. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk about EditText first. So EditText, I mentioned part of this. So EditText used for entering stuff with keyboard, seek bar, left to right, and then we've got, so we use a combination of checkboxes. If you have more than one thing you want to pick, radio buttons will put into a radio group. If you want to say, hey, pick one of these options. Radio group is actually a subclass of linear layout. So it works actually exactly like linear layout does. You put items into it, and then you can either orient them vertically or horizontally. But the radio group manages making sure that there's only one thing picked. That's what actually does the job. It's not the radio button by itself, it's the radio group that actually takes care of that work. Switches, turning things off and on, spinners, choosing from a list of items. So every view that we have, every widget, every control that you're going to see, all of these are subclasses of the view class, which means that provides the basic functionality, the base work for everything, right? So like onClick is available for every one of these widgets because it's in the view class, right? So all of these can handle the onClick event, although more often than not, we may want to handle also some more specific events that are specific to a particular kind of control. Okay, so focus. So whatever view has focus, we generally say, or gets focus, we say it has focus. So again, only one item can have focus. We can't say, okay, well, this one and that one has focus. It'd be whatever you click on. So typically the way you change that is you're going to just tap on the field and that will change it. You can also see it change by physical buttons the user might have on their device. So some of the older devices, some of the older smartphones have a kind of a trackball is usually what they called it. Not too many newer devices have this, but if you're trying to support older devices, they're going to have some buttons that kind of look like that. So you had a kind of an OK button in the center, and then left, right, up, down. So on devices that still have that, those can be that can still be used for navigation. Okay, so that's kind of fallen out of favor because we've removed most of the physical buttons from our devices. But there is still code in there. It's usually still recommended to put some degree of support in for those. The way those work, it's relatively easy kind of emulate that as you're running through the emulator. You're just going to use the arrow keys on your keyboard. So the arrow keys on your keyboard typically fire the same events as that trackpad. Same thing if the user was using a Bluetooth keyboard, right? It would fire that. Those arrows. So that's the other way that focus can change, is through physical keys like that. The other thing that happens, we kind of look here, if you have the soft keyboard, remember there's a button that shows up in the bottom right of the soft keyboard, usually where the enter key would be. Well, the enter key changes. So sometimes it will be enter or return to put a new line there. Sometimes it will be tab, sometimes it will be done, sometimes it'll be search, sometimes it'll be send. So that icon, that button can change depending on the context. Okay. But that's typically part of how the user is going to kind of tab through the layout. You can't actually just use, if you're using one of the emulators, it does respond to your keyboard, so you can also use the tab and the shift tab keys to go back, forward, and back through there. But your general expectation should be most of your users will be using it purely through tapping. So you got to make sure first and foremost it works if you don't have any sort of keyboard attached, any physical keys attached. and then adding keyboard support is a nice thing. So any control can be clickable or not clickable. You can say, hey, when you click on it, something happens, or you can say, well, nothing happens when you click on it, right? And that's as simple as saying, do I have an on-click listener or do I not? If I don't have an on-click listener, then nothing's probably going to happen unless it's already built into the control, right? So like a checkbox already changes state without us having to do anything in the on-click event. Controls can also be focusable or not focusable, right? So some controls you may want the user to be able to highlight, so other ones you might want the user not to be able to highlight, right? So your usual text view, which is we use as a label, normally isn't focusable, right? Because the user can't do anything directly with it. You can also do the same thing with fields. If you say this field is for display only or disabled, right? That's going to take us out of focus, right? Make it not focusable if it's also disabled. So you can have states like that, and again, there may be special cases where you want to make something focusable that isn't normally focusable, or you may want to make something that's normally focusable not focusable. So we can change that with an attribute. So normally the way that focus kind of goes through is we start at the topmost item in, So if you tap on an item, the way it takes focus is it's going to go to the topmost item. So if you have items stacked, this item, you have a layout, and then a layout, and then a layout, or whatever may be behind it, right? The event's going to go to the thing on top, right? So whatever, if there are things stacked, it's typically going to go to the thing on top. Okay. Once, as you're going through hitting the done key or the next key on that keyboard, it's typically going to go from top to bottom, left to right. It's typically how it's going to work, just kind of out of the box. You may remember in Windows Forms, remember how we had to set the tab order, right? By default, the tab order was just what order did you put the controls onto the UI, right? And here we kind of have that same thing in the sense that the order that we drop them into the designer is the order that they'll show up in the XML. So I may want to reorient that. But we kind of nowadays understand that going by the order if you drop things in is usually a problem. So instead, Android really tends to ignore the order that they are in the actual layout, in the actual XML, and go by where they are visually. But that can sometimes cause issues because sometimes it doesn't get it right. Most of the time it will, but there are cases where it might get that wrong. And they're talking about directional controls. That's what they mean by this. So interact with directional controls. That could be the trackpad. It's one of those things, trackpad. So one thing we want to make sure as the user is using the app, we want to make sure that there's some sort of visual indication of what has focus, right? And sometimes that means that we need to change the current control to a different color. Sometimes that means, just having the cursor in there that's blinking. With text fields that edit text, that may be enough. But with some other controls, sometimes we have to give them a little bit more visual cues. Okay. It also can help to have some sort of indication that something is clickable. So especially if we're doing something odd, right? If we're making something clickable that isn't normally clickable, then we may want to indicate that to the user somehow. If we're making something not focusable or focusable that normally wouldn't be, we also kind of need to indicate that to the user. So the general rule for kind of giving the focus guidance or hints to make sure it by default picks up the right order. Well, first of all, you can't order the items in your layout. That can potentially help. But the most important thing is to kind of arrange them visually how you'd like the user to go through, right? If you arrange them from top to bottom, with nothing left or right, you'll probably get the right order, right? If you arrange them from left to right with no top to bottom, you'll probably get the right order. Where you get the most problems is where you're doing some left to right and some up and down. That makes sense? That's where you tend to get the most problems. So for instance, if I were to say, I've got two input fields, and I've got a button here in between them. What's the focus order?
So it'd be first one, and then the one to the right, and then the one to the bottom.
Okay, so you could say it might be this one.
Yeah.
Okay, what's another way that I could go through there?
I was thinking that top, bottom, and then right.
Okay, so top, bottom, and right. So I go through this field, and then I go over to the button. Well, either of those are valid, and typically the way that it'll pick, usually it's going to pick this one by default. Usually it's going to pick that first one where it's going to go from here to there to that. Because it's going left to right and then up and down. So it's usually going to do that first. Now, which one of those is better? Which one of those is more user friendly? Huh?
I think in general, this layout is not user friendly at all.
Okay. In general, yes, there's a problem because the user, it could be either, right? Just by looking at the layout, it could be either one, right? So maybe what you need, right, is you maybe have to put some more specificity in there. Because sometimes it might be one way, sometimes it might be another way, right? So let's say, rather than just having these arbitrary boxes, let's say I've got width, I've got height, and then I've got the button in between. Given that, which order would you expect? Okay.
You would expect focus to go start at the width, go to the height, and then to the button.
Why?
Because
Right. If I go width and then get focus on the calc button, right, it doesn't make any sense to click on the button until I've entered the width, right? It's because the order of the operations come in. So in this case, if I need to enter both of the fields and then click the button, well, obviously then I'd want focus in that order, right? Now what if, let's say this is the username, let's say I've got a register form of some sort or something, or let's say I'm creating a user account. And I've got name, password, and then I have a submit button down here. And I have save and maybe some other things in between. That's something else, right? Because where does the generate pass really fit with? It fits with the password field, right? So what order of traversing this makes sense?
Name, generate pass, and then pass.
Does it?
Well, if you type in a password and then click generate cache, it's going to delete what you typed.
Okay, that's right. So if I type in and then hit generate, then I'm going to lose the password I typed in. But what happens if I go to this and the keyboard drop disappears and then it reappears here? Is that okay? Because remember, this doesn't take keyboard input. So it's like, oh, I can dismiss this off keyboard.
Yeah, I think it's fine. It dismisses the keyboard.
It's not. Because they're going to see a major blip, a major screen change if that happens. So what I would argue is maybe the better traversal here is to take it out entirely, out of the traversal. You just go right past it. If you're tabbing through, you go right past the generate pass button. The only way you get there is you tap on it directly. Does that make sense? Because there's not a good way for it to work when it's in the traversal, especially when that might be an optional step, right? That might be something they don't normally do as they're using the app, which is using the screen. Does that make sense? So sometimes buttons like that, they're kind of on the side of a particular field, which usually I would put this, because it goes with the password, I would put it more closer here. Sometimes it makes sense to make it not focusable. Does that make sense? So it's just going to skip past it. So if I want to mark something focusable or not, in the XML, I can just say focusable is true. And that means the focus, that control can have focus. If I set false, then it's going to just skip right past it.
So is focusable by default? No.
It depends on the control, right? So like a text view by default is not focusable. An edit text by default is focusable, right? So on a control by control basis, you kind of got to know what is and what isn't, right? So that's one of those things you have to play around with your UI, and you're tabbing through it and using it and figuring out, okay, what makes sense for these things to be focusable, what makes sense for some of these things to not be focused. You also have the option, again, sometimes it gets the focus order right. Sometimes, like in this case, I may need to force it to go a particular way. In that case, I can add some additional attributes. So like next focus down is going to say, if you go down, here's the control it should go to instead of where it would normally go to. Does that make sense? There's actually a few of these. So if I look at, it's a good Stack Overflow answer that kind of goes through those different properties. All of them, you take an ID. So I say, what control do I want to go to next? So I've got down, left, right, up, and that again corresponds to that whole arrow trackball thing. But if I want to say, do it with tabbing, which is that done or next key in the keyboard, I would say next focus forward, right? So forward is what's the next control. So in this case here, what I need to set is next focus forward on the height to point to the button, or I need to set next focus forward on the width to point to the height, right? I need to do both of those things. Let's say, here's the next one you go to, there's the next one you go to. Does that make sense? So that's how we force it to have a different order than what it's going to pick based on where things are visual. And that especially happens if, say, you have a UI where your expectation is they go down all the fields in this column and then over to this other column and go down. This is not something you're going to see. I would never recommend doing that on a phone, but sometimes on a tablet on a tablet, it's worth doing something like that, especially if you're working with a large table, kind of think like a spreadsheet, right? In some cases where you're kind of building your own spreadsheet, it may be worth having the user do, and then go to the next column. Okay. So if we want to get in and change the focus from the code side, we can do a few things. So first of all, we can set focusable, whether or not a control is focusable on the front end. And that's generally the right way to do it. You generally want to set it in the XML, not in code, because that leads to a lot less issues of timing and such. If you put it in the XML, for sure it's going to be set the right way right at the beginning, right? So the only place where I would actually recommend using the set focusable method is if it changes after the app starts. That makes sense? So let's say you fill in some values, they hit next, and now additional values show up, right? So I might initially have them not be focusable and then make them focusable at a later time. Or let's say they're putting in shipping and billing information, right? I might initially have both of those there or one of those not, and then they, depending on whether they check the shipping same as billing, that checkbox, I might change whether or not the other section is focusable. More than likely, I'll just disable them, but you could say, let's set it focusable. You can also say request focus. So request focus you call specifically on a view. You don't call it on the activity. You call it on a view, and you say, okay, I want this control to now gain focus. Does that make sense? So there may be things that the user does, like let's say they hit the calc area button here. We may want focus to move back to the width, right, once they've calculated. So that's where I would say take the width control and say request focus to move them back there. I can also set a focus change listener. That way I will get events anytime that control either gets focus or loses focus. That's not one that we can actually hook up in the designer, in the XML. So if we want to listen for focus change events, we have to actually hook those up in code. And that kind of comes out as two events. The actual event that usually is fired when you set up that on change listener, on focus change listener, is that on focus change event. You look at the interface real quick here and bring that up. So if we're looking at that interface requires us to implement two different methods. This is not the page I'm looking for. Okay. There. On focus change. So the first event that comes out is going to be on focus change, and it has actually two parameters that I'm noticing. So the first one is whether is the control that this event got fired on, but the second one tells us whether or not it has focus, right? So if it just got focus, that's going to be true. If it just lost focus, it's going to be false. Does that make sense? So some of these events have additional data. And is that the only one? Yeah. So that one only has the one input there. I was thinking that was one of the ones with two. If I am curious about what controls currently have focus, I can call on the activity. I can say get current focus. That will return me the view that currently has focus. I can also do the same thing on a view group and say in this view group which control currently has focus. I would say the most common one to use in there, though, is that first one is on the screen to say, hey, tell me which thing currently has focus. So, talk about entering text, entering numbers. So the default way that EditText works, assuming you don't set an input type, is that it's going to allow you to have more than one line of text. And when you're allowed to have more than one line of text, what you get here is the return key. You notice how the symbols, kind of the down and left, right? So that says if you press that button, you're going to get another line of text, right? So when it's in multi-line mode, you have that button. You don't actually have a done or a next key. That makes sense? Which actually means that usually if the user has one of these entries, it means that they have to actually go back to the screen to get to the next input. Now, one thing that happens usually when a keyboard shows up, you see this little arrow? What's changed? Because usually doesn't that usually points left, right? So usually we have a back button, right, which goes back to the previous screen. Once a keyboard pops up, this will actually turn to a down arrow, which means that this button now dismisses the keyboard. Does that make sense? So it becomes an arrow to dismiss the keyboard instead of a back button. So you can click it, dismiss the keyboard, and then it'll go back to being a back button.
Does that stay, like, keep control on the current text or edit text, or does it pass to the next one?
So the focus doesn't change. If I push the keyboard down, the focus doesn't change. See if I can pull up a real quick example in Android Studio here. Be worth seeing in an emulator. So I want to open existing project. I'm going to go to here. Projects. Why don't I open up my login screen project? Okay. Alright, so I'm going to go to the login screen project. I'm going to delete this button so I don't have anything in there right now. So to get to these edit texts, I'm going to go over to text. You'll see there's a bunch of these here for displaying kind of different types of text. The top one is maybe the easiest place to start. Here is I'm going to just drag in plain text. Now, if we look real quick, notice what the input type is set to by default. What is the input type set to by default? It's set to text person name, right? So by default, it's actually assuming that you're going to enter somebody's name, which is kind of honestly, kind of a weird starting point.
Doesn't the text person name input type have a couple different things checked on the keyboard? Or not on the keyboard, but like I was looking at it before, it said it wasn't just expecting just the name, I thought.
So I'm gonna take that type off. So we're just kind of go back to the default. I'm actually, and one of the things I want to do, you'll notice it's already put text in there that's pre-populating the field with. So a general rule, you want to make sure that you remove that. I'm going to go over to the hint and put a hint there. So I'm going to say, please enter email. Right. So please enter your email. I'm going to put another plain text in there. Which one are you looking at? Oh, Yeah. So let's, oh, yeah. Yeah, so it's a combination of those things. Yeah, so I'm going to uncheck. I'm going to go back just to just a type. Just a text. There we go. So I want to go just to type text. Same thing here. I really want this to be just type text. Okay, so both of these there. Clear out the text. And please enter your password. Okay. So I've got hints in there. I want to anchor these controls to the sides. I'm going to anchor this one to the bottom side of there. I do want to make sure that I go back into 8 margins. Eight. Okay. And let's have this expand. Horizontally. Okay. I'm going to anchor this one up here. Maybe for now, I'll just put it at 32. Okay, so let's see what we get here. So again, both of these fields, one for the email, one for the password. Oh, cannot find symbol login button. Oh, because I need to go remove some code. Okay. Okay, so I got 2 fields, and you'll notice but initially when I open that screen, I open that activity, nothing's picked, right? So I do have focus on the email field, but the keyboard hasn't shown up yet. See that? I do have focus, but keyboard hasn't shown up yet. So if I click into that field, I'll see the keyboard pop up. You see what the button is here right now. Anybody know what that button, what that symbol means? Right here. What is that done? What is this button going to do? Huh? It's like a tab. We call it the next button. Right? So if I tap that, it's going to go to the next input, right? And notice when it went to that input, now that it's on the last input, it's changed this little check mark, right? So here we have the next button, here we have the done button, right? So it's changing that automatically without us even having to say what button to use. It's figuring out which one's the last one and which one's not the last one, right? So that happens automatically. And one of the things that we wanted to see here, it didn't actually switch. It's not actually showing me the physical keys down here, at least on this device. But you saw the back arrow. If I tap the back arrow, it didn't actually go back a screen. It actually dismissed the keyboard. Did you see that? So normally on devices that kind of have those as kind of sort of software buttons, right? They're rendered digitally. You'll see that change where it'll be a back arrow to a down arrow. Now let me change this real quick. I'm going to change the input type on this first text field. I'm going to flag. So yeah, you do see that there's a bunch of checkboxes, right? So there's a bunch of things we can turn on. And actually the way the input type works is it's actually a combination of things, right? So you can actually combine it, well, it's this and that, right? So what we want is we're going to say it's text, but I'm also going to check text multi-line, Okay, so that's going to allow me to enter more than one line there. So I've got text and text multi-line. You run the app again. So now when I go in here, notice instead of a next button, you see how it's kind of changed into an enter button on the keyboard? So if I type in 1, 2, 3, enter, and you can see actually that the field is getting taller and shorter by itself too. So that's another big thing to take into account when you're having multi-line text in your screens, is you have to know that they're actually going to grow and shrink as the user is using them. And one of the many things that that means is usually on Android, if you do have something that's multi-line text, you usually want it to be farther down on the screen. You usually want to have it closer to the bottom of the screen, and you want to keep all the shorter inputs up at the top of the screen. Does that make sense? That usually creates a better user experience. But it also means that while things might fit right now, if I push it all the way down, well, now I might actually need a scroll bar to see everything, right? See what happened. Where did my password field go? See, it disappeared off the screen, right? So if I do have multi-line text, there's a very good chance that you will actually need to add a scroll bar or a scroll view to that view, even if you might not otherwise need it. And the other thing that's worth noting here, notice that when I'm entering into this field, and this happens anytime I have something that's not just a number, notice that if I set this as type text, so I have a full keyboard field, right? I don't just have the number pad that you see with number decimal, right? So I've got a few things that I can do in there. So first of all, you'll see that there's the letters. We're used to that, right? You also can see, in fact, I've already gotten the ability to put emojis in there. So by it being plain text, all the normal text fields in Android can have emojis in them. Okay. We'll also notice if I go back here, you see these suggestions. So it already is giving me those suggestions as well. And all of that kind of comes up simply by the input type that I pick. You'll also notice one thing that maybe people don't necessarily know a lot of. You notice how there's these little numbers on top of the top line? Does anybody know what those are about?
If you hold down the key, it gives you the option to select that number.
So if I hold down the E, you'll see I have a little pop-up here with additional options. So I could get to the 3, but notice there's also some other interesting letters here, so like E with an umlaut, right? So that can be interesting too. One of the things that means is, A, it has really good international support, but that also means that then you really, as a developer, you really do have to code with that in mind, right? And recognize that what they type in might not just be English, right? And so you have to think about that as you're writing your code that deals with that text. So we saw the big kind of setup of all the different options that are there. So we can either set those in code or we can set them through that checkbox. It's going to be in the code, it's going to be Android input type is text person name. Now you saw when I did the multi-line version there, I checked more than one box. So if I actually look at the code for that, you'll see that there's a bar in between. So if you are combining more than one entry mode, that's how you're going to do it, with a pipe in between. You know, if you remember in Java, C#, that's kind of like a bitwise OR, which is actually what it's doing. It's actually bitwise OR in all those constants together. So you may see that sometimes when you need to create kind of a specialized input, is you may need to pick more than one thing. So the main ones that get used fairly often, you've got text sort, message, text long, text person name. Those are kind of the common ones that you might use. There's not really much difference between those three as far as the actual how they work out. They're all going to give you a keyboard to enter basically a single line of text. There's just maybe some slight differences between those, but they're not all. I haven't been able to find good documentation on what the fine differences between those are. My assumption is that these probably at least have some input on what your suggestions are up at the top. Okay. If we set the input type to phone, and we're going to get a very different keyboard. Okay. So we're going to get a numeric keypad that's actually different than if I put in number, decimal. So I have the numbers arranged. Notice that they're all arranged, first of all, how we traditionally have them on a physical phone, right? So you have 1, 2, 3. Also notice that there's a few things kind of going with the numbers. You see those additional letters that go with it? So those show up when you have input type phone. We also have some special characters like dash, dot, or we can get in here and put stars or hashes, because sometimes those are needed for phone numbers, right? So this, while it looks very similar to the number input, there are some definite differences between the phone keyboard and the number keyboard. If you looked at them side by side, you would see that they're functional. Okay? So that's one of the things you need to be aware of. Okay? So that does allow dashes, does allow periods. There's additional special characters that we can get to. And just like previously, there's going to be a done or a next key down at the end. So just to remind you, as far as working with this, we can use find view by ID first to get the control. And when we want to retrieve the value that's in there, we're going to say, we'll take the editText.getText.toString. And that works regardless of what the input type is. That makes sense? So regardless of what input type it is, it always gives us back a string, right? So it might be set to number, it might be set to number decimal, but it's actually just giving us back a string. Because what's in there doesn't have to be a valid number, right? They can leave it blank, they can have a single dot there, or things thereof, right? So what we're getting back is always a string, regardless of what the input type is. Regardless of even if it's multi-line text, we get that back as a single string. Now, some modes that may be helpful and worth looking at depending on what you're trying to do. So first of all, there's one that says text cap characters. So what that's going to do is force everything that they type in to be in all caps. You might need that for the purposes of an ID of some sort, or you might need that for passcode. Let's say if you're giving them kind of a one-time code that they need to enter, that might be a good place to force it to be uppercase, so the user is not confused of, does this need to be uppercase or does this need to be lowercase? You might also do that similarly with an email, where the case really of an email doesn't matter. So you could do that as well. Cap sentences, so that's going to force it to enable the shift key. Every time they get to a new sentence, it'll automatically turn the shift key on. So that's probably something you want to turn on for multi-line text. Probably that's a good place to do cap sentences, unless you're having them enter code, right? If you're having, for some reason, telling them, here, enter a block of code, you probably don't want to capitalize sentences because those don't work the same way. We also have text password, which we can use in there. That'll show the stars instead of showing the actual text that the user types in. Typically, it will still show you the last character that they typed in. Okay. We've also got number, decimal, all of those kind of groups to say, hey, we want the user to type in a number. If I remember right, number by itself is usually just allowing an integer. I don't think that one has the decimal point on the keyboard. Text email address is actually an interesting one, which I want to look at here in the login screen. So let me go back first to text person name. This is kind of text short message, because this will be of interest to us. Okay. So right now I have it set to text short message, right? Now, one of those special characters that I always need to put in an email address, remember, is the @ sign, right? So I probably want to make it easy for the users to type an @ sign. All right, with the normal keyboard, where is the @ sign located? How do I get to it? I have to go to symbols, and I have to go there, right? So that, and then I have to go back to the letters, right? So that's what? 4 clicks, basically, to get an @ sign in there, right? Might not seem like that much, might seem kind of a, oh, you know, that's a minor thing, but it's kind of a big deal. So we want the user to be able to get to that @ sign a lot quicker. We might also potentially want them to be able to get to .com quicker, right? Because those both are common things that go into an email. So if we change the type, notice, look at the keyboard is right now. I'm going to change it to text email. Text email address. I'm going to run it again. I'm going to pay attention to what the keyboard looks like now. Okay. So notice what's been added. If it's an email address, the @ sign appears right here. Great. Depending on the particular keyboard that you're using, because you can actually get different keyboards for Android, and especially if you're using a keyboard on a larger screen like a tablet, you might actually have things in here like .com might actually be suggested, might actually show up as buttons. But we'll notice that the @ sign and the dot, right, they're both there where I can easily get to them. So I don't have to go into the symbols at all to type my email. So let's say I do that. I guess I should be using the keyboard on the screen. Right? So the point there is if you set it to email address, they don't have to go and find those characters typically. Let me also, while I'm here, I'm going to go, so we've got text email address here. I'm going to change the other one to text password. Okay, so we saw that one. Right, so as I'm typing, it's turning them to dots. Right, so that's what I want to see on a login screen most of the time, is I want to make sure the first thing is text email address, and then the second one is text password.
So I just noticed that sometimes with mobile apps, there's a button next to password which says show password. When you click that basically just removes the type.
Yeah, so that would basically change it from a text password to a text field. or text short message or whatever, but
one
just text.
method
What do you mean?
of like manipulating the type through code.
Yeah, that would be one case where you might need to manipulate the type through code. But the general rule is your input type, right, should be initially whatever you want it to start as, right? The only reason that you should change that in code, whether same thing with focusable, same thing with input type, you should only change that in code if it changes later on. Anything that should be there when the app starts should be something you define in the XML. Okay, and we saw the phone input. There's also a date time input, which again gives us a slightly different keyboard. So that keyboard looks a lot like the numeric keyboard, but instead it's got slashes, dashes, colons, the special characters that make sense for if you're typing in a date or a time. Okay, so that's one big thing to know. If you change the input type, it's going to change what keyboard shows up. It's not just about changing what characters are valid. It's also about making it quicker for the user to use your app. Does that make sense? That little thing of setting the input type to the right thing can have a really big difference to how well your users receive your app, how usable it is.
Does the email have built-in validation testing on this?
Well, no. So you still have to build that in yourself to validate whether it's a valid email address, but it will at least help the user get to their. You still have to do the validation. And then just a reminder, most of your fields should usually have a hint. And if you do have a hint, you should probably move that hint into strings XML, just like we would do with the text, right? So typically we're going to leave all our edit texts. We're usually going to leave them blank, no text, and only have a hint there. That's kind of the normal way of setting things. One thing to pay attention to there, if I've got text in there, notice it's going to be dark, usually black, versus if it's a hint, it's usually going to be gray. So you really want to make sure that you're kind of looking at the color of that text to kind of get a hint of which one is it. Okay. So that button that appears in the bottom right, where we saw done, we saw next, we saw return, we often refer to that as the action key. Okay, we generally refer to that as the action key. We can actually change what that button is. So if we want to change it to be something else than what it is by default, I can use the IME options setting. That attribute will change what the default action button is, what the action button is. So if I wanted it to be the next button, I would set that to action next. If I wanted it to be done, I'd set it action done. Action send, action search are also in there.
Does that IME option use, or not use, support implicit intents then as well?
It just changed what the button looks like. So it doesn't automatically cause an implicit intent to go out. We have to write the code to send that implicit intent. Okay. It's just giving the user a visual cue as to what will happen, right? So if I set it to action done, it'll be a checkbox, that check mark. If I set it to action send, what you'll see is what looks like a usual little paper airplane. It's usually the icon that they'll use for a send. Or if you set it to search, they're going to see a little spyglass or magnifying glass. Does that make sense? So it's a way to hint to the user what's going to happen when they click done. That make sense? So by itself, that just changes the icon. What we have to actually do is then handle that. So what I can do, text view.onIt or action listener, I hook up that listener in code, that will then tell me what action actually got sent. So then I can say, okay, it's a send action, go do this. Right? It's a search action, go do this. Although more than likely, I'm just going to say, well, it can only be one thing, so here, do this thing. So that's how I write a listener that responds to that event. So if we're thinking about the rectangle calculator that we did just a few days ago, I have those fields, and I also have that calc button, right? Wouldn't it be nice if the user didn't have to hit the calc button, right? So typically, one of the things that we want to do is we want to handle the action events on both of these controls. So I'm going to handle the action event here and say calculate. I'm going to handle the event on the width and say calculate. That way, as soon as they enter a new value, it automatically does it.
Do we really want to do that? Betting on the fact that when they click that action, that both inputs have been entered by the user?
Well, for the height, it's obvious, right? That's the last one.
It is, but also, I mean, users can be stupid.
It's I would say I would disagree on that and say it's obvious. Right?
Okay.
If I filled in that last field, I want it to go ahead and give me the output.
Okay.
Now, if it was going to send me to another screen, that's where I might wait. I might wait if it was going to send me to another screen. But if it's just displaying the results here in the same screen, it's definitely a better user experience to go ahead and do the action that they just asked me to, right? The assumption is if I hit done, I want it to go do the calculation, right? So yes, there may be cases where that's not the case. It is possible that that may be not what you want to do. I think about if you're posting an article, maybe I don't want it immediately to post the article when I hit done on the last field. That would be a case where I wouldn't do that. But for most things, including like ordering something online, typically when you hit done on the last field, it's going to initiate that order. Because you don't want that order to kind of stop and say, oh, okay, well the user got mostly done, but because they didn't push the order now button at the end, we didn't get that order, right? Does that make sense? So we want to say if they hit done here, it recalculates. I'd also want to say it recalculates on the next. Reason being, maybe they've entered values already. I've said maybe 10 and 20, right? If they go back and change this value, it should recalculate without forcing me to go hit done down here. Does that make sense? I don't necessarily want to have to go back and change all the values again just to get it to initiate the event again. Let's take a brief break and come back at 2 o'clock and we'll continue with the rest of this. Okay. So we talked about text box. Let's talk about some other controls, right? So these other controls are going to be focused on giving the user options, right? Giving the user a set of predefined choices. Right, so first up we have checkboxes, we have radio buttons, we have toggle boxes, we have toggle buttons, we have switches, we have spinners. Okay, so we're going to talk about these kind of in sections. So first up we've got checkboxes. The whole point of those is to give them a set of options where they can check and pick more than one thing. So for instance, in the bottom we've got, hey, I want to have a sundae. I can choose to have chocolate syrup, sprinkles, crushed nuts. I can choose to have all of those or none of those or a mix of some of those items, right? Now, if I set up a list of checkboxes like this, is it easy for me to set it up in a way that that can change? right? So maybe I need to pull those entries from a database. Not really, right? So checkboxes are really good for most part when we know ahead of time what the values are going to be, right? It is possible that we might stick checkboxes into, say, a recycler view or a list view. Then we might have the option of have them being configurable. But for the most part, if we see checkboxes, they're going to be fixed. We're going to predefine them and say this is what they have to be, right? So if we want to change the layout to add checkboxes or remove checkboxes, we're going to have to push out a new version of the app, right? We can also handle, just like we did with buttons, we can handle the on-click listener. So that's one way to kind of get a hold of, well, when does that value change, right? If you want to initiate something to happen when they check the box, you can do that with an on-click listener. The better way perhaps to do that, in most cases though, there's also a compound button on check change listener, and that will fire anytime the box is checked or unchecked. That's usually the better one to listen to rather than the click button, the on-click event. Usually that's the one I would recommend. There are some cases where you may still want to listen to just the on-click event. However, this is another way to listen for that. Now you'll notice that it is compound button on check change listener, right? You remember some of the ones that we've seen before, like view on-click listener, right? So that says the on-click listener can work with anything that's a view, right? Well, I said compound button, right? So but inherently I'm saying in there, anything that's a compound button, I can listen for when it changes between checked and unchecked, right? So what does that tell you about a checkbox? If I'm telling you can use this with a checkbox. If everything's a view, so everything can take on click, well, that means so if we look at the hierarchy for, say, checkboxes, we're going to see that they're compound buttons. So most of these controls that we see just in a minute, radio buttons, checkboxes, switches, toggle buttons, all of those are actually compound buttons. So all of those we can actually hook up this same listener to. Okay. So if we want radio buttons, we're going to make sure that we put them inside a radio group. That way they get selected. That way we kind of, if we select one, then it automatically deselects the other. We can do that in landscape. We can do that in vertical orientation is kind of the norm, but we can also do that in horizontal orientation. Horizontal orientation is actually really good if either we have kind of short labels on the small device, right? So if it's only a few characters, we might be able to do them horizontally on a phone. But really, more often than not, they shine actually when you go to a landscape orientation. So a lot of times your radio buttons, it's worth to kind of have them vertical in portrait and horizontal in landscape. Does that make sense? Usually you get more use out of your layout that way. Which one of the things that means is if you have radio buttons in your layout, you definitely should consider having one version for landscape and one version for portrait, because there's a good chance that you can make it a little bit more optimized. Now we can handle the on-click event on a radio button, but as a big general rule, I would say most of the time that will probably cause you more headache than it's worth. So usually rather than handling the on-click event on the radio button itself, we're actually going to put the listener on the radio group. Okay, so similar to how I have a compound button, which that goes on a single control, I can put this listener on the actual group of radio buttons, and then it will send me an event anytime one of those radio buttons is picked. That make sense? So that way I can, let's say I have 5 options, I don't have to hook up 5 listeners, I hook up 1. Just 1 listener to the radio group, and it'll tell me, okay, the new value is this one. So that's generally how I'd recommend listening for events with radio buttons. Okay. We can also have toggle switches and toggle buttons and switches. You'll see this is how those switches work. If it's highlighted or to the right, you can kind of see it's on, it's off, so it gives the user some good visual indication of what state it's in. And we can also have on, off toggle buttons like that. These are generally recommended for kind of standalone settings, right? So if you have a group of settings, right, like the ice cream toppings, that makes sense as a set of checkboxes, right? But if you have a set of something that's either on or off, it's generally better to create it this way because it's going to give the user a better indication of what it's actually doing. Sometimes checkboxes can be really hard to read as to what it does. Does that make sense? Sometimes it can be a case of, okay, if it's checked, it does this. If it's unchecked, it does this. Sometimes it can be hard to read for users to say, okay, which way is this setting is off or on. So that can be helpful. If I have more than just a few options, which radio group's okay, but it's only good in a few certain special situations. So in order for you to use a group of radio buttons, you really need to have 2 things. First of all, you need to have a set of options that is fixed, that doesn't change, and you want to have a set of options that is small. Okay? If you have more than, say, 5 options, 3 to 5 options is kind of the cap for a radio group, you should be using a spinner instead. Part of that is a screen space question. The other side of that is otherwise there's just too much noise on the screen that distracts from what else is going on. So that's the general rule of things, is the more options you have, if you have more options, you should use a spinner because it takes up less space, but it also can organize things better. It also is the case that a spinner is much more easier to change dynamically, right? So if I have a spinner, I can say, well, maybe I want to pick from some items that are stored in the database or stored to a file, right? That makes more sense. So if you have data, again, that is dynamic, it's not fixed or not predetermined, it's generally better to use a spinner than a radio group. So the way we set up a spinner, we need to drag the spinner control on, but they're actually not as straightforward as that. There's some additional steps that we need to do in order to actually use a drop. So the next, one of the steps that we have to do is we have to create, let's say we're just talking about a predefined set of options. We need to create something called a string array. Okay? That string array will go into our strings XML file, just like we've done previously, for the purpose that it still needs to be translated into other languages. Okay, but we'll create it with the string array tag instead of just the string tag. Once we've got that resource, the next thing we have to do is actually use something called an array adapter, which is kind of a go-between between the array of strings, or the array of items that we want to show, and the actual visual UI. So that's what the array adapter's job is. It takes the array, turns it into controls, and goes back from those controls back to the actual data that's underneath. Okay. Now, the way we'll do it today, it only works as long as you just have an array of strings. You can actually use an array adapter with any array or list of objects. So it's actually much more general than that. But the only thing that you'll see today with this lesson is how to do it with an array of strings. But keep in mind that it can be done with any kind of an array. So the way that we define that array of strings in the strings XML is going to look like this. So we start with a string array tag on the outside. We're going to say what's the name of that array. So here I'm calling the name of that array is phone_types. And then I've got a few different items. So home, work, mobile, other. So those are the options that will show up. Does that make sense? Again, this is going to show up in that strings XML file just like we had previously. But usually to put this in, you'll want to just go hard code. You'll want to go directly to strings XML and start typing it in. It's not something that we usually do the extract resource sort of method for. Okay. So once we have that in there, and once we have a spinner on our UI, here's the code that we need to add into our onCreate method. Because typically we want to show the, we want to set up the values once and we'll leave them there. If it's something that's more dynamic, right, then we might need to set up this array adapter in another event. But usually we'll do this in the onCreate method. So first thing, we need to grab the spinner, just like we would with any other control. We say find view by ID. Here I've called it phone type. I'm going to go grab spinner. Okay. So step one. The next thing I need to do is create the array adapter. So this array adapter line is kind of long. It's actually spanning 3 lines here because of how much type, how many characters are actually in there. So the first thing I need to know is I'm going to call array adapter.create from resource. That's the magic method. Okay. So that's a static method on the array adapter class. It takes 3 things. It takes the context, which I'm providing it this as the current context. Then I need to tell it what array to load, right? So remember I called the name of the string array back on the previous slide was phone types. So that's what I have here, r.array.phonetypes, right? But it's an array, so it's not r.string.phonetypes, it's r.array.phonetypes, okay? Then the third item we have here, Android R layout simple spinner item. Okay? So that actually provides a layout resource, which is what we're actually going to use to show the items. Okay? Now, what we have here is the one you're going to use most of the time. R layout, Android R layout. So this is a layout that's already built into the Android R operating system. It's just the default that we use for graphics. And really, all it is, it's just a single text view. It's really just a layout with a single text view in there to show the text. So if we want to make the drop-down items look different, we can swap that out. We can swap that out for one of our own layouts if we want the drop-down items to look significantly different. Now, most of the time, the better way to go around it is going to be to use theming, which we'll talk about in a later lesson. That's usually the better route to kind of change how these drop-downs look, but this is one way that you can do it as well. Does that make sense? Especially if you want to start putting icons and other things in there, you may need to use your own layout. So we create the layout. If we look at the signature for create from resource, we'll see that it returns an array adapter of char sequence. So that parameter part is saying what kind of objects am I holding in there. So we've got strings here. Char sequence is what we get. The reason we get char sequence is, remember, you can also put things like HTML into your strings, right? So that's why they're char sequences and not strings. Does that make sense to support that? If I wanted to have people or employees or orders, this might be array adapter orders, right? So it's specifically what kind of item is it holding. So that's step 2. So again, find view by ID is that first step. Create the adapter is the second step. And then finally, I have to tell the spinner about that adapter. So I'm going to say spinner.setAdapter and give it that adapter. At that point, it now has the items that are in the string array. Does that make sense? Unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as just saying, hey, spinner, here's the list of strings that I want you to have. So we have to go through this array adapter to actually populate the list. But the reason that exists there is because spinners are actually quite a bit more advanced, can do quite a bit more than what they can do in some other UI frameworks. So I can actually make that, as you saw, I'm passing in a layout, I can actually pass in whatever layout I want, right? Which gives me a lot of power potentially to do some things. If we want to listen for when an item is selected from the spinner, what we use is the adapter view dot on item list selected listener. So you'll say spinner dot set item selected listener and give it one of these objects. And now to implement that, there's actually two methods on this listener. Which can be kind of a gotcha. And I lost my slide there. So the two methods that we have to implement are first on item selected. On item selected actually takes a few parameters. So the first one you see is kind of the parent, the adapter view. So that'll actually be the spinner that the user was interacting with. So we'll have the spinner that the user interacted with, and then I have another view. So that's the actual view that the users see, okay? Or the one that they clicked on. So remember, if I'm looking at a spinner, I have the spinner here, which holds maybe their current value, which is, say, home. The window pops up to show them their options, which is usually going to show up as kind of a dialog on mobile devices. So I might have home, work, other, right? So that first thing that I get, the adapter view, is going to be this control over here. It's going to be the actual spinner. But the second item, that view, is going to be the text view here that's showing the actual work. Does that make sense? That's why you're getting both of those two things. You're getting the control, the spinner that they're interacting. You're actually getting the control for the individual item over here. So view would be like the other, this text view. If they clicked on that, or if they clicked on home, that would be that text view. Okay. Now we also have two additional values there. So we have an int and we have a long. So that int position tells us which index is it in the original array. That makes sense? It's the index in the original array of items. So if we get 2, we know they picked the third item in the array, right? There's this fourth item for the long ID. As a general rule of thumb, I've never seen a valuable use for that. And I've not seen a good definition either of really what is supposed to happen with that. What it says here is the row ID of the item selected. What that means, I don't know. So usually I would recommend, if you're listening for that event, pay attention to the position, not the ID. Does that make sense? I'm sure there's a reason that that's there. I have yet to see the reason that that fourth parameter exists. There's also another event. So this is if they do pick something. If, however, there's nothing selected, which is another event, the user doesn't pick anything, you'll see that's another one we have to implement. So we actually have to implement both of these callbacks if we want to implement a listener. Okay. Does that make sense? So there's one for when they pick an item, there's one for when they don't pick an item. Because oftentimes when this dialog pops up, there may also be, say, a cancel button down there where they can cancel out of that and such. Okay. So to kind of review, we talked about a few different kinds of controls. We talked a little bit about focus. We talked about text inputs, ones that can take kind of free-form text or that can take numbers. We also talked about different ways of providing the user with a way to pick a choice, right? So what are some of those controls that we talked about today? Give me a list. Huh? Okay, spinner, what is a spinner? Huh? Okay, use a string array to populate it. Not really. It's like a drop-down list, right? So oftentimes we hear spinners referred to as drop-down lists, but remember they don't always behave as drop-downs, right? They're only usually as drop-downs on a tablet, on larger devices. A switch. Okay.
Toggle on and off.
Okay, so I can do a switch for on and off. What else can I use?
Radio button, check button.
Radio button. You said check button?
Mm-hmm.
You're close.
Check box.
Check box. What else? EditText. What?
That's the, you can do like different email.
Right, so how did we change input type, right? So input type is probably the most important attribute on the edit text. Right, that's probably the most important attribute to set. What else did we talk about? What are some of the other controls that we talked about? I know that there's at least one missing from that list. Seek bar. Okay. We only talked about that one briefly. Again, it's not usually the most common control. Huh? Okay. Is that a control? I mean, hint's important, but it's on that's when we're talking about edit texts, we can set a hint.
Toggle button.
Toggle button, okay. Right, switch or toggle button.
Choose the button. See that on the list.
No. And on that note, we have talked about text views. Okay. So when we talk about focus, what are the attributes that we can use to change how focus works? So focusable. Okay. So what does that mean? So it can be. Can you say that again? Because I couldn't hear you.
True or false, so we can change it to be focusable or not to be.
Okay, focusable. There's one attribute that we set. Was there another attribute in there that I mentioned?
Clickable?
Nope, there's no clickable. How do I determine whether something is clickable or not? I give non-click. Yeah. So if I have an on-click, then inherently it is clickable. If I don't have a listener that does something when you click on it, well, it's not clickable, right? You can try to click it and nothing happens. What was one of the other ones? Again, about the focus. What if the focus order is not what I want it to be? How can I change it?
We can do like next focus.
Okay, next focus, right? Which one?
Next focus down.
So what does that one do? What does next focus down do?
Goes to the, you can tell it which one to use.
Go. You can tell which one to go to when. What does the user do?
When they hit the little tab thing. Tab button.
Nope. You're talking about the one on the soft keyboard?
Yeah.
So on next down does not trigger, does not work when you're hitting the basically the tab button. So that's if you're hitting the down arrow, right? On that next focus down is when the user hits the down arrow on their say trackpad or keyboard or whatever. Which is not the most common one. You may need to look at that Stack Overflow article that I linked. What attribute do I need to set?
Is it next focus forward?
Forward, right? Remember, so there's up, down, left, and right, but that's when you're going on trackball. Basically, what that's used for. But if I want to actually change where it goes on a tab or on the soft keyboard, I need to do next focus forward. So that's actually the more important one to remember is next focus forward. Not just next focus down. Because most of your users will be going through the soft keyboard. They won't have a physical keyboard. Does that make sense? So again, typically you don't have to set that. Typically you don't need to set next focus forward. Usually it will get it by default. Usually it will go to the next control by default. You only need to set that if you want it to do something different than what it's already doing, right? So what is its default behavior?
Isn't it whatever's closest to
Closest to it?
whatever's closest to the right of it?
Okay, to the right of it. So if I have an input field here and a label feet, well, that's close to it. So the next thing would be the feet label, right?
The next thing to the right of it or on the next line, or to the most right on the next line that can accept string input.
Not string input, but it can accept focus, right? So it doesn't go just to the next thing, it goes to the next thing that's focusable, right? So it's not actually going to go to that label because that label is not focusable. Does that make sense? So it only concerns the things that are focusable. It doesn't matter whether it can take a keyboard or not, or whether it can take text input. It's whether or not it's focusable. That makes sense? Okay. Any questions before you guys start on the labs for 4.2? I think from what I was from what is here. So it looks like, so for the lab for 4.2, you should be continuing with Droid Cafe, which you started yesterday. And it's going to basically ask you to make an order page. So that is the main task there. The coding challenge here, I do want you to go through that. The first coding challenge and the second coding challenge. Yeah, so the second coding challenge as well. So the first coding challenge is going to be inside Droid Cafe. The second coding challenge is actually going to ask you to make another app entirely, another separate app. Is that clear? So what I would expect that app to be called is keyboard dial phone. You can kind of see they've called it that at the end. I don't see that anywhere at the top, but that's what I would expect is the name of it. The homework is down here as well. And for the homework, they're also going to ask you for another app, right? So that's what I want from you for tomorrow, is that homework, and go through both of the coding challenges. Oh, well, Monday. Not tomorrow, Monday. Monday. It is Friday after all. So Monday, that's the expectation. We'll start on 4.3. No. So that's where we're at.